Well, Energy Media readers, we're going to be talking to Dr. Amy Fox today. Welcome to the interview, Amy.
Thank you very much.
And Dr. Fox has written a very interesting study about fracking and induced earthquakes. And rather than stumble around the science and get it all wrong, I'm going to turn it over to her. So, Amy, if you would mind giving us an overview of your study and maybe explain a little bit about induced seismicity for our readers.
Sure, happy to. Thanks. In late November, there was an induced earthquake in northeastern BC that got the attention of the oil and gas energy regulator, and they reached out to my company, Enlighten Geoscience, to see what we could do in a fairly short time frame to try to understand what happened. So that earthquake, it was determined it was caused by hydraulic fracturing in a horizontal well that was drilling for hydrocarbons in what's called the Montney Formation. And we've only, as an industry, only sort of recently come to understand that hydraulic fracturing can actually cause earthquakes. We've known about induced earthquakes for a long time, and very loosely defined, an induced earthquake is just something that is accelerated by human activity. So we've known about induced earthquakes in other areas like fluid storage, fluid disposal into deep formations, and it's only within the past couple of years that we've become certain that hydraulic fracturing is also inducing some earthquakes.
Now, some of my readers have heard about the problems they had down in Oklahoma. Yes. Which were caused by disposal wells primarily, but also some hydraulic fracturing, I understand. Mm-hmm. So what that means is produced water that comes out of the well has to be pumped down someplace. And so oil and gas companies will pump it down at high pressure back into another reservoir through a well. And over a long period of time, that set off a series of earthquakes in Oklahoma that was actually quite serious. It was a real problem down there. So we're not in Alberta and in Northeast BC. We're not anywhere close to being to that level of a problem, are we?
No, we're not. And in that area of the country, even though it's not on an exact boundary between different tectonic plates, it's always been susceptible to natural seismicity. And then by injecting all those fluids, we kind of accelerated the seismic events, and yes, their seismic activity increased, I want to say exponentially, don't quote me on that, but like it really increased to hundreds of earthquakes a week. And you know, these are relatively small earthquakes. These aren't San Andreas fault type earthquakes that are gonna, you know, the big one, but they can be troublesome and can cause some issues.
Yeah, we should talk about that for a little bit, because I remember the study that came out in 2015, 2016 from the BC Oil and Gas Commission, the first one about induced seismicity. Oh no, it's 2012. And then there was another one that came out 3 or 4 years later, but on the same topic. And most of the earthquakes at that time were microquakes. So they would be 1.8 to 3 on the Richter scale, if I remember correctly. And anything over around 4 and up is a problem. And now that's where you feel it at the surface, and you might feel it, and you might damage some property. Have I got that correct?
Yeah, it varies with each specific location, and what you're kind of describing is how we've developed what we call stoplight protocols. So we allow operations to continue and say, well, if any events happen over, say, a 2, we need to start paying really close attention. If it's over 3, maybe we stop operations and take a look at what's going on, see if it's safe to continue. So every area, whether it be Oklahoma or West Texas or Alberta or BC, they all have their own thresholds. But yes, most induced seismicity is quite small, on the order of 1 to 3 or 4 on the Richter magnitude scale.
Now, in your study, if I understand this correctly, and again, the non-scientist, the non-geologist here, but I understand that what's the greater understanding or the insight that comes in your paper is what happens when plates are very close to being ready for an earthquake, and the effect that can have, the hydraulic fluid under great pressure can have on that. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you've got the basic concept correct. So there are stresses in the earth no matter where you are. You don't have to be near the San Andreas Fault. And those stresses are always kind of pushing on the rocks in the subsurface. And if there's already a fault there, eventually that fault will probably move. And we do have some natural seismicity in Alberta and BC, even in the interior part here. So it's not, we know we have faults. It's not unusual that they would slip, but we may be, by injecting fluids, either through disposal or hydraulic fracturing, we may be kind of imposing an extra fluid pressure that then makes that fault a little bit weaker.
Now, the thing that I'm really curious about is I know that when fracking crews are up in that area, that they have to set out seismic arrays, or there has to be some measuring there to track this. Are we at the point now where we can actually do preemptive measuring, or you can determine if there are in fact tectonic plates that are close to being ready to be to slip? Can we know that ahead of time, and so that we can take more precautions?
Yes, we definitely try to do that. There was a recent paper published in 2018 where they mapped the Permian Basin and the known faults that were in that basin, and they color-coded the faults in terms of the risk of inducing earthquakes on them. So that's kind of a really nice example of what we can do. Many operators, so oil and gas companies, they do that work internally. Even before they'll hydraulically fracture a well, they will have done a pre-assessment of how risky it is. And they may even, for your viewers that don't know what hydraulic fracturing is in detail, hydraulic fracturing in a single well has many stages. So they'll do maybe 10 or 20 or 30 different fractures and along that horizontal well. And the operators will do a lot of work to make sure, like if there's a fault, if they've identified a fault somewhere along the well, they may not fracture over that specific zone. So they are doing precautionary work to assess the risk beforehand. The real trouble is it's very hard to know what the faults are underground, because we have a lot of technology to find them, but it depends on the scale, and it's always geologically hard to know exactly what's going on underground.
I remember, I think it was 2015 when the Fox Creek, that big 4.5 earthquake happened up at Fox Creek in northern Alberta. And that was kind of a big deal at that time. I remember talking to, I think it was Professor Gu at the University of Alberta, who was talking about how difficult it was, exactly what you're talking about. But it seems like the technology has come along, and maybe our expertise has come a long way in a very short time, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, we're still using some traditional tools like seismic imaging of the subsurface, and that has a limitation on the size of the faults it can find. There's also some limitations on how the fault is oriented, whether or not it shows up in that kind of data. We have other types of subsurface information. So a lot of times when wells are drilled, the oil and gas companies will run what are called wireline logs down in the well. And some of those logs can actually come up with an image of the well bore. So we can use those images, for example, to try to identify if we've crossed any faults with the well. So we have a variety of technologies at our disposal. They all have their limitations, and they're all costly. And so how they get applied, it's not very uniform across a given area. And so that was one of the main exercises of our study earlier this year, was to determine what information is out there that we can use to try to figure out what we have for faults and fractures in the subsurface.
Is there new and better technology coming along that will make your life a bit easier and allow you greater insight into where these faults are?
There may be, I think, but I hesitate to depend on new technology when we actually have quite a bit of existing technology that we could be using in a more robust manner to try to do this work. And that was one of the primary recommendations out of our study, because it was a very short-term study, and a lot of the conclusions were recommendations for further work. And one of the big recommendations was to take all this existing information and analyze it in a very consistent and complete way.
Now, I had the privilege a couple of years ago speaking at the Geoscientists Association, their annual symposium. And so I spent a whole day listening to presenters talking about some of these things. And one that caught my eye at that time was the use of supercomputers to crunch huge amounts of data to give us insights we couldn't have had otherwise. Would something like that come in handy with the kind of work that you're doing?
I can't say no because I'm not an expert enough in that area. Geological data is notoriously horrible for trying to apply machine learning, but we are trying, and we know that insights will come out of it. One of the things we're attempting to do is use, I don't want to say big data, but I will say kind of a machine learning approach and a statistical approach to figure out if there are certain types of geological risk factors or operational risk factors that are seem to be more closely linked to induced events. And that may help us focus in on exactly what kind of information we need to collect in order to assess risk.
Now, I found this very interesting reporting on Texas and Oklahoma, because Oklahoma, my impression was that the regulator there did not do a very good job. And in Texas, the Railroad Commission, my impression again, is that it did a much better job, but not a great job. Whereas it seems to me the Alberta Energy Regulator and the BC Oil and Gas Commission have been on top of this for a long time, and they've been a lot more proactive, and industry seems more willing to cooperate, or they seem to have a good working relationship to solve these kinds of problems. Is that a fair statement?
I honestly don't know much about the regulatory aspect down in the States. I mostly followed the scientific part of the whole thing, but just from my own experience working with operators and regulators here in Alberta and BC, they are on top of it. They are on this very early. We are nowhere near the scale of development that we see in Oklahoma or Texas, and we're also nowhere near the level of induced seismic activity. So we are in the early stages and addressing it, right at the beginning and making sure it doesn't become a problem.
Well, Amy, that's all the questions I have. This has been very enlightening, actually. And any final thoughts?
No, I just thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Okay, take care.